Basically, since August, there have been huge youth-led protests numbering in hundreds of thousands, up to 100,000. And these protests have been led by an organization now calling itself the People's Party, after the People's Party that led the 1932 revolution against the absolute monarchy. It's not just students, because if it was just students, you wouldn't get these numbers. This is one of the biggest protests here you're seeing on the slide. The demonstration is unprecedented because people have come out publicly to criticize the monarchy. And the Queen happened to drive past one of the demonstrations, and she was met with pro-democracy salutes and so on. I'll talk a bit more in a minute about the role of the monarchy. The protesters now have three major demands. The first is that the Prime Minister General Prayut Chan-o-cha resign. The second demand is that a new constitution be drafted by the people, not by established politicians or conservative figures. And the third demand is for the reform of the government, the reform of the monarchy, sorry. The present government under General Prayut Chan-o-cha is what I call a parliamentary dictatorship. Prayut Chan-o-cha staged a military coup in 2014. He then set about designing the roadmap to what I would call guided democracy. That's after the term that was used in Indonesia. Basically, he and his military junta appointed the Senate, they control the courts, and they organized elections last year which were fixed so that he would win. So not surprisingly, Prayut Chan-o-cha is still Prime Minister. There's widespread censorship, although people find ways to get around this, especially on social media. There is intimidation of activists. Activists are visited at home by soldiers and so on, and some of the key activists have been arrested a number of times and face a number of charges. The nature of the regime is such that soldiers have a role in society which goes far beyond the normal role of the military. For example, they're used to intimidate people, and there are death squads and so on. The three-fingered salute, which has now become a general pro-democracy salute in Thailand, was borrowed from the Hunger Games film. It first appeared in protests against the General Prayut's 2014 coup d'etat, but it is now a sign of defiance against the regime and the ruling elite. In the past, since the 2014 military coup, opposition to the military junta or the parliamentary dictatorship has been sporadic, fragmented. And it wasn't long ago that some of the student leaders that organized small symbolic demonstrations were saying that there was no need for mass protests in an era of social media. Well, that has been turned on its head. The younger generation who are leading this protest clearly see the need for mass protests and not just a question of symbolic protests and the use of social media. They certainly use social media, but they also organize on the ground, face to face. And I think this is one of the interesting issues that face all of us as activists throughout the world, the role of social media and the role of mass movements. What is striking about this protest is the leading role of young women. And this is even more striking because many of these young women are secondary school students. They started to protest in schools during the 8 o'clock flag raising ceremony, where people made the three-fingered salute, and they had to argue and tussle with teachers who were trying to prevent them from doing so. They also turned up at the Ministry of Education because the minister, the junta appointed minister, had threatened them. And also they're very unhappy about the education system. And the junta appointed Minister of Education tried to address the crowd of secondary students, but he was shouted down with calls of lackey of the military junta. And so he lost face in that. Also, what's very interesting is the fact that these protests have drawn in a wide range of issues. For example, demands for GLBT rights, demands for legalized and safe abortions, because it's still very difficult to obtain legal and safe abortions in Thailand. And there have also been people on the protests who have raised the issue of self-determination for Patani. The comrades in Malaysia will know very much about this. Patani was divided between the British colonialists and the Thai ruling class. And people in Patani are Muslim Malays. They speak a different language, and many of them would like to see self-determination. Now, the key question is, why are young people in revolt? Young people are in revolt because they have no fear. This particular generation have no fear. This is unlike the older generation, for example, the red shirts, who were pro-democracy movement 10 years ago. They were shot down in cold blood in 2010 by people like General Prayut. And the older generation carry a baggage of defeat and repression, but they've been re-energized by the courage and determination of young people. So the young people, this generation, have no fear. The young people are also impatient at the lack of change, at the entrenched conservative nature of Thai society, especially in education systems, but in other areas of society. It's prevalent throughout Thai society. And one of the slogans of the movement of young people, or led by young people, is "Let it end with our generation." In other words, we've had enough. Other people, previous generations have tried to change society, but and been repressed and knocked back, but let's be successful this time. Another issue which has propelled young people to revolt is COVID and the economic impact of COVID. Young people feel that their future prospects are not very good given the circumstances, and the military junta is using COVID as an excuse to crack down on demonstrations. And finally, the thing that is propelling young people into revolt is the behavior of King Ungpakorn, and I'll talk about this later. So people are very angry with the behavior of the king, and they want to see the monarchy reformed. Now, when we talk about this young people's revolt, the lack of fear and so on, this isn't exclusive to Thailand. We've seen it in Hong Kong, and actually there are direct links with between some of the activists in Bangkok and some of the activists in Hong Kong. We've seen it in Chile, where there've been mass protests, and also they've managed to win a referendum for a new constitution, something that many Thai people will understand, because the Chilean constitution was drawn up by the dictator Pinochet. We're seeing it in the protests against police brutality in Nigeria. We're seeing it in the Black Lives Matter protests in the United States and Europe. And we're seeing it with the school students' climate strikes in Europe. So this is a phenomenon of this age, that young people are in revolt, and that's a good thing. And it reminds older people like myself of the 1968 mood. And we shouldn't forget the historical parallels as well as the international parallels, which I've just talked about. The mood in Thailand at the moment reminds me of the mood in the early 1970s, a mood which was influenced by the mass uprisings in Paris, in the United States, in Japan, and also in Chile. And this led to the great 1973 uprising against the military junta in Bangkok. And that wasn't the end of it, because Greek students who were struggling against their military dictatorship shouted "Thailand, Thailand" in their protests at the Athens Polytechnic. Now, I need to talk about the monarchy. Here is King Vajiralongkorn in his favorite outfit, shopping in Germany. Now, King Vajiralongkorn's behavior on a number of issues has enraged people. His attitude towards women is appalling. He has a harem in Germany, and he spends most of his time in Germany. His consorts, if he falls out with his consorts, some of them can end up in jail and treated in appalling conditions. He's totally money grabbing and selfish. He changed the constitution to allow himself to control all the funds associated with the monarchy. But I need to make a point here, and that is that he doesn't have overall power, in my opinion, to change the constitution on any other issues. The junta give him slack when it's about his personal wealth or his personal lifestyle. The man is what we could call socially challenged and self-centered. A friend of mine who's been following Thai politics said, when referring to Vajiralongkorn, she said, "It's like the lights are on, but there's nobody in." Ambassadors had previously told me, when I was still living in Thailand, that it was impossible to hold an intelligent conversation with Vajiralongkorn when he was still Crown Prince. So this is the kind of guy who is now King of Thailand. Now, I think we need to look at the history of the monarchy. Since the Cold War in the 1950s, the military and the conservative elites have been involved in creating an elaborate hoax regarding the monarchy. The monarchy, as all monarchies are, even in Britain and Sweden and other places, the monarchy in Thailand is a symbol of the idea that there is a natural order of class society. Some people are born high, some people are born low, and you mustn't question it. Now in Thailand, this idea is enforced using the iron fist of the military. There are a number of laws that prevent you from criticizing the monarchy and so on, and I fell foul of the lèse-majesté law when I was asking the question why King Bhumibol, his father, didn't oppose the military coup against an elected government. The military and the Conservatives have promoted the monarchy in Thailand to a godlike status. This is not possible to do in Western Europe due to the strength of the working class and civil society, because people wouldn't tolerate it. But because of the weakness of the working class and civil society in certain periods, especially during the at the end of the Cold War and in the 1980s, the military and the conservative elites have been successful in creating this image. So you see an image of an all-powerful monarchy. Here you see the people with real power, the generals, groveling on the ground in front of this socially challenged king. And this is a complete play act. It's an image created to strike fear into the hearts of ordinary Thai citizens, so that they think that the king is an all-powerful god, and nobody should question the elite's rule. But it's a complete lie, and people who are familiar with Marxist theory will see that this is actually a classical example of what Marx called alienation. When we are unconfident, when we are not active, when we are fearful, we are prepared to believe any old rubbish that comes from above. It's not that people are stupid, it's a question of confidence. But as the Marxist George Lukács explained, when people start to struggle, then the scales fall from their eyes. And actually we're seeing this to some extent in Thailand. Today people are not fearful, as I've said. There's a lot of fear. For example, that's the Queen's car, and this is one of the responses from people in the street, which is unprecedented. However, I should add that at the moment, most of the leadership of the movement believe that King Vajiralongkorn is some kind of absolute monarchy, which is not the case at all, and I'll go into this a bit more. Because Bhumibol, his father, was also weak and unconfident. He used to give very garbled speeches and so on. And Vajiralongkorn, as I've said, has even less ability as a political leader. Now you can see this kind of hoax, or the use of godlike figures in other countries in slightly different ways. For example, in Iran, the excuse that God determines certain things gives power to some of the ruling elites to enforce their will. Or in the case of Turkey, the military have traditionally attempted to use the leader Kemal Atatürk, who died quite a long time ago, but it is illegal to criticize Kemal Atatürk in the same way as it is illegal to criticize the Thai king. Now, I think that we need to look at the way that Thai history has related and reacted towards the class struggle and the nature of the monarchy. The first thing to say is that Thailand is not a feudal society or a semi-feudal society. Thailand actually went through a bourgeois or capitalist revolution, and the ruling class built a nation state, the first nation state, because Thailand doesn't exist before that. They did this in the 1870s. And it was a bourgeois revolution, not like the French or the British English Revolution, but one led from above by King Chulalongkorn. King Chulalongkorn staged a revolution against the old Sakdina feudal system. This is similar to the bourgeois revolution from above that took place in Japan, the Meiji Restoration. And this revolution that King Chulalongkorn led against feudalism was in response to the encroachment of British and French colonial powers. So, and the case of Japan is quite similar. The bourgeois revolution and the building of the nation state, of course, created problems which we see today in Patani, but because people were included in the Thai nation without their consent. King Chulalongkorn, after staging this bourgeois revolution from above, established the first capitalist absolute monarchy. Absolute monarchy didn't exist under feudalism or the Sakdina system because it was a dispersed system of power. So the absolute monarchy was created, and the feudal order was destroyed because King Chulalongkorn wanted to take control of the economic and political power that local rulers and bosses had previously held. The absolute monarchy established by King Chulalongkorn only lasted 60 odd years. It was an unstable situation. And in the midst of the 1930s world economic crisis, the People's Party, a coalition of left nationalist politicians like Pridi Panomyong and military men who actually leaned towards the right, although they were anti-monarchy, people like Jomphun Paw, Pibun Songkram. They staged a revolution abolishing the absolute monarchy in 1932. This revolution had mass support, unlike what is claimed by conservatives. They claim it was just a coup by a small group of people. It wasn't. There was mass support in the countryside and in Bangkok among peasantry and among the working class. But the coalition that staged the revolution was full of rival factions. So, you know, the left nationalists versus the right-wing anti-monarch military. And so they took turns in controlling the country. But this all changed in the period of the Cold War when General Sarit staged a coup d'etat with US support and started to re-promote the monarchy, re-promote the king. This time, eventually, was the King Bhumibol. But the king was dependent on the dictatorship which promoted him. Now, I think it's very interesting that the Marxist historian Christopher Hill, when talking about the English Revolution and talking about, you know, in the English Revolution, Charles I had his head cut off, and England was a republic for a short period of time under Oliver Cromwell. But when Oliver Cromwell died, they brought back the monarchy, Charles II. Now, Christopher Hill says Charles II was called king by the grace of God, but really he was king by the grace of the merchants and the squires. Basically, the capitalist ruling class in England brought back the monarchy as a symbol of the fact that, you know, you need to know your place. They didn't bring back the monarchy in order for it to rule over them. And I would say the same thing about the Thai king. The Thai king is king and was made king by the grace of the generals and the capitalists. Now, the relationship between military dictatorship and the king, this Cold War arrangement, was upset by a mass uprising in 1973. This is the mass uprising involving students, workers strikes, the rise of the Communist Party, left parties in Parliament. These are things that occurred as a result. And as I've said previously, this is influenced by the 1968 wave, also the defeat of the US in Vietnam and Mao's Cultural Revolution. So the 14th of October 1973 uprising against the military, which was successful, changed this Cold War relationship. However, only 3 years after that, the Thai ruling class hit back with the brutal crackdown on the 6th of October 1976, which resulted in many students who were already influenced to some extent by the Communist Party leaving the cities and going to join the guerrilla struggle in the countryside. I think it's worth saying at this point that by the time the 6th of October 1976 crackdown took place, the US had stopped supporting the actions of the military dictatorship and actually pressed for the release of the student leaders. After the 6th of October 1976, the Communist Party of Thailand, CPT, organized increased armed struggle. They were Maoists, and one of the weaknesses, in my opinion, is that they didn't see the cities as the center for struggle. If you look at Thai history up to today, the cities have always been the center of struggle. It's not the countryside that is the center of struggle. In fact, rural people like some of the red shirts, although there are red shirts in the city, rural people came to the city to protest. Now, the Communist Party's struggle failed by the mid-1980s. It failed because of its concentration on rural areas, and building a peasant army was a bit of a pipe dream. Also, the analysis of the Communist Party was that Thailand was a semi-feudal, semi-colonial society. Now, I've already explained that feudalism ended in 1870, and Thailand was never colonialized in the same way that Malaya or Burma were colonialized, and certainly wasn't a colony of the United States, although the United States is a powerful imperialist power even today, and does influence what goes on the world scale. Other countries do as well, like China. The Communist Party also failed because the student activists who had been very militant and looking towards struggles for freedom were disillusioned with the authoritarian nature of the Communist Party. For example, they weren't allowed to read certain books. The Communist Party in some ways was a mirror image of the military dictatorship. The Communist Party never translated Marxist capital into Thai. They only allowed the student activists to read the thoughts of Mao Zedong and a few other books. And the Communist Party, the last nail in the coffin was when the Chinese government and the Thai government started to have good relations. Now, after the brutal crackdown in 1976, the Thai ruling class gradually moved towards what I would call managed democracy. And it was managed without any left parties that had existed after 1973. And by the late 1980s, there were relatively free and fair elections. But at the same time, in order to open up this managed democracy, they decided that they needed to manically promote King Bhumibol in order to keep the population in check. So you had pictures of King Bhumibol with a drop of sweat on the end of his nose, as though he was the only one in Thailand who ever did any hard work. Or there were pictures of him tying his own shoelaces, and people would scream with delight that he could do that. But anyway, this managed democracy, there was a hiccup in 1991 when the military staged a coup, but they were quickly overthrown by a mass uprising a year later. Now, after this, we see the Asian economic crisis in 1996. The Asian economic crisis propelled the political mood in Thailand towards reform. So it was part of the process that pushed for a new progressive constitution. This is partly as a result of of course, of the uprising against the military 4 years previously, but also the economic crisis. And it's interesting that Rosa Luxemburg, when she talks about reform and revolution, she says that important reforms take place as a result of previous uprisings or revolutions. So you can see that the 1996 crisis and the progressive constitution that was drafted and put into place as a result of this was influenced by the 1992 uprising against the military. The Asian economic crisis also had an impact on, it changed the nature of electoral politics, because it's at this time that you see the rise of Thaksin Shinawat's Thai Rak Thai party. Thaksin Shinawat used a dual-track economic policy. In other words, he used grassroots Keynesianism, government spending and so on, in order to raise the development level in the countryside. But he was also using free market economics on a national scale. Thaksin Shinawat believed that the poor were partners in development. Previously, mainstream politicians had just treated the poor as though they were a burden. Of course, Thaksin was no socialist, but he saw that modernization of the infrastructure of Thailand and development at grassroots levels would benefit modern capitalists, including himself. And he brought in the first universal healthcare scheme. So Thai people enjoy or have a universal healthcare scheme, which is better than anything that's present in the United States, for example. He also brought in debt relief and job creation in the rural areas. And some ex-CPT Communist Party people were part of the Thai Rakthai party. Because Thaksin managed to win the hearts and minds of ordinary people, not just rural agriculturalists, but also working class people in the cities who benefited from, or they benefited because their relatives had universal free healthcare for the first time, and they didn't have to help out because organised workers were covered by a national insurance scheme. Anyway, the fact that Thaksin had managed to win the hearts and minds of the poor, of the majority, in fact, in Thailand, meant that he started to gain a monopoly of electoral support. And the right-wing politicians couldn't compete with him, because to do so, they would have to promote policies which went further, and they weren't. And the right-wing politicians who are opposed to Thaksin were extreme neoliberals. They still are. Now it's in this period that the middle class show their real nature, fearful that their privileges in society are being undermined by Thaksin's pro-poor policies. They turned against Thaksin, and the NGOs, to their shame, felt that the government was undercutting their role because it was doing a lot for rural development, which much more so than the NGOs could do. And unfortunately, the NGOs joined with the middle classes in order and protested in such a way against the Thaksin government that they invited in the military to stage a coup. Now, I'm never supported Thaksin. I felt that his policies didn't go far enough, and he was also responsible for a number of state crimes. For example, at Bak Bai, where he murdered, or is responsible for the murder of many Malay Muslims, but also in the war on drugs. But the protests that the middle classes joined were actually extremely right-wing royalist protests, people wearing royalist yellow shirts and so on. And the coup eventually came in 2006, and this sparked a political crisis in Thailand, which has still not ended. We're still seeing the results of the political crisis, the division between the royalists, the people that support the military, and ordinary people who want to see democracy. And part of the movement was the rise of the red shirts. This here you can see how massive their protests were, and it's fair to say that the red shirt movement was the biggest pro-democracy social movement in Thai history. Hopefully the present social movement, which is still struggling, the one led by the young people, will become even bigger than the red shirts. So I want to summarize some of the key issues before I end. First of all, it's important to see a continuous struggle between rulers and the ruled. This is not just the case of Thailand, of course, but in Thailand, if you read mainstream articles, they often talk about, the history of many coups d'etats, but they don't talk about the history of uprisings against the military. So it's important to see a continuous struggle between those rulers above and people that are ruled from below. And I think a Marxist analysis is actually the most useful. A Marxist analysis is also useful in understanding social movements, because for Marxists, social movements aren't just single things that rise up in certain periods. Social movements are like trees with branches and so on. So the present social movement, the mass movement led by young people, is one of the branches of a tree which started in 1932, went through the 1973 uprising, 1992 uprising, and the red shirts. And people have learned lessons. There are people that have been involved in more than one event and so on that are part of these movements. The second issue, which is one I touched upon at the beginning, is the question of how social media relates to mass movements. And because there are some people who still believe that you don't need mass movements, you just need social media and symbolic gestures. I think most of the activists in Thailand don't believe this anymore. They're into mass movements. The third issue is that struggle can change people's attitudes. It's a tool to end alienation, so that people can start to think for themselves, start to see what the lies that the ruling class are perpetuating. And struggle is also important because it has a tendency to spread in terms of the issues. So it brings in people who are very unhappy or oppressed in many ways, like LGBT people, issues of women's liberation, issues of racism, issues of self-determination, and so on. And finally, I think the issue that faces us right now is that the protest movement is at a junction. It's been very impressive in organizing repeated protests in Bangkok, very large ones, but you can't carry on doing the same thing over and over again. And the big question that needs to be answered is, what is the power to overthrow the military junta? Because you need to make the country ungovernable in order to crack the ruling class and push forward with the power from below. And I think that it's important to state, and my view is that the way that the movement should progress is through spreading the ideas, the courage, the militancy into the Thai working class. And it's not just factory workers, it's people who work in offices, in transport, work in hospitals and so on. And it's workers' strikes that can actually make the country ungovernable, like the strikes that took place in Sudan, like the strikes that took place for a period in Egypt and other places that can shape the ruling class. Unfortunately, the number of people arguing for working class strike action is quite small, and this is because Thailand doesn't have a socialist party. Because a socialist party, revolutionary socialist party, would be arguing for such a thing. So not only is this final issue about power, the power of the working class, but it's also about how you channel the ideas into people to increase the level of struggle and the need for a revolutionary socialist party. Thank you very much.
And I've been following Thai politics very closely. And of course, the politics of other neighboring countries like Indonesia, Myanmar, and all that. But Thailand is one of the most fascinating countries for me because culturally it's very interesting. And I mean, for Malaysians, I think Malaysians love Thailand for the food, for the you know, for travel, shopping, everything. And yeah, and also a lot of Malaysians are also Buddhists, so they find Thailand as a very attractive, peace-loving Buddhist country. But what really caught me, you know, what really got me thinking over the years is like two questions here. One is related to the future of royal family, right? We know that the royal family plays a very important role in Thai's politics, and I have many good, very close Thai friends, and they are very nice people. But I also know that they really revere the former king, Bhumibol, and I never questioned that. I never wanted to challenge that because I think I ought to respect what they really believed in. They really had a lot of respect. The former king, they actually loved him, but I can see the change ever since the former king passed on, and I can see some of them have started to question the current king because of his behavior and all that. So I'm just wondering, like, to what extent is the Thai society reflecting on the role of royal family? Are they actually questioning the monarchy as an institution, or is it because they simply do not like the current king? For example, like if let's say, I know Princess Sirinthorn is still quite popular with a lot of Thai people. What if there is a chance of her taking over from Maha Vajiralongkorn? Would that ensure some kind of survival or regain the popularity and respect of Thai society as a whole? And this is one. And second is, what are the chances of Thai military going back to the barracks? We know that the military has been playing a very important role in Thai politics as well. They intervene, there have been so many coups over the past so many years. So I'm just wondering, if you look at the countries in Asia, like I can only think of Thailand's, no, I can only think of South Korea, Taiwan, and to a lesser extent, Indonesia, in which the military had actually, you know, agreed to give up their power and, you know, gone back to the barracks. And now in these three countries, largely, they are led by civilian governments, and there have not been any significant, you know, military intervention, probably nothing at all since for the last 15, 20 years. What about Thailand? The factions within the military, and I don't know to what extent Prayut is actually in control of the situation. You know, the former Thai armed chief, what's his name, Apirat, and also the current one, you know, I don't know whether they are in the same faction or would have, you know, how would that, you know, the relationship between them and also the relationship with the royal family, with the Thai society, what are the, you know, the chances of the Thai military actually reforming itself alongside reform in Thai monarchy? Yeah, these are my two questions. Thank you.
I had three questions that I had. Giles, you talked earlier in your presentation about the importance of Hong Kong and its influence on the Thai uprising. And there's been a lot of debate about the strategy and tactics of the uprising in Hong Kong. And Along Yu just wrote a book that was published from Pluto called Hong Kong in Revolt, in which he underlines one of the most important developments in the Hong Kong uprising, which was a turn by a layer of the militants to the working class and some of the new trade unions. And I just wondered if that generalization from the uprising in Hong Kong has had any impact on the political and strategic and tactical debates inside Thailand. So that question is about Hong Kong and also about the turn to the working class and whether there are any signs of that among the militants that are leading the uprising right now. The second question, really, it's just two questions, is Giles, in a lot of your writings, you've underscored the importance of understanding the relationship between the king and the military, and that the military is the primary enemy, and it's dangerous to get trapped in seeing the king as having the power in the situation. And at least in the United States, there's a real highlighting of the question of the monarchy and not so much the question of the military power. So I just wanted to ask you to draw that, the power relations out a little bit more clearly, because especially in the US, I think that's important for people to understand.
The question about whether people are questioning the monarchy as an institution or as a person, I think it's in flux at the moment. People are focusing on the individual nature of Ungpakorn, but I think that it's safer to do that, to say, well, we're not struggling for a republic, but actually I think that many people have come to the conclusion that what we need is a republic. But it's difficult to gauge, but I think it's in flux. Could they put the princess in instead? No. This is an issue when Bhumibol was at the end of his life, and people were speculating about it. To put the princess in instead would be to admit that the godlike figure, the male godlike figure of the king, anointed by the powers above, is actually full of flaws, and also it would destroy the idea that there's this ancient, which is nonsense, but the myth that there is an ancient tradition, because having a princess that becoming the queen, the head of state, is not, it doesn't fit that view. So I don't think it's possible. Would the military reform itself? Well, it's interesting that the examples of South Korea, especially in Indonesia, but South Korea especially, the military didn't reform itself. It was actually pushed back into the barracks by mass struggle, the strength of the South Korean working class, and so on. And that's what would actually push the military back into struggle, into the barracks. In fact, the military did go back into the barracks after the 1992 uprising for a while. So it really depends on whether the pro-democracy movement wins this time or not. The links between the Hong Kong protesters and the Thai protesters are there, but I don't think that the links involve people who see the working class as important. I totally agree that it's important to spread the struggle to the working class in Hong Kong and in Thailand and other places. But unfortunately, I don't think that particular link really exists. And in terms of the power of the monarchy, I've already talked about this. In some ways, people that are protesting against the monarchy and talking about an absolute monarchy, they're actually questioning the whole role of the monarchy, and that's a good thing, even though I think that many of them falsely believe that that Ungpakorn is trying to become an absolute monarchy, because it actually the criticism of the monarchy makes the possibility of a republic easier. It also undermines the military because because they use the monarchy as a symbol. But it really depends on the struggle, and the danger among some people who believe that the monarchy is all powerful is that they say, well, there's no point in overthrowing the military junta because the monarchy will still be there in charge and so on. And that's completely false. I'm not sure that the majority of people who are in struggle right now share that particular view, but there is a tendency among people who put too much emphasis on the monarchy to just watch it like a soap opera, and not really care about trying to actually make sure that the movement wins. Thanks.
I think my question has to do with the Thammasat University massacre in 1976. It's something I'm writing my history thesis on at university. And I'm focusing on the remembrance and documentation of it and how the right has tried to suppress memory, but how there have been efforts to remember it as well. So I was wondering if you had any advice or anything to say about like remembrance of it, or for any students writing about Thai history that can be controversial. Thank you.
In terms of the 6th of October remembrance, I think that the process has been going on for quite a while. From the 20th anniversary of the 6th of October uprising, people started to organize events, public events, and it became fairly mainstream. So it's not that there's anything. I don't actually believe that now there is anything that needs to be discovered. I mean, I was involved with organizing some of the events. I was involved with others like Sutachai Yimprasert in looking at the event and taking witness statements and so on. And I think that what's very clear is that this was a united reaction by the Thai ruling class to suppress the growing socialist movement, because the students at that point in time believed that they supported the ideas of socialism, even though they may not have been clear about what it really involved. And so there's a lot of material, and I believe that there's a special unit at Thammasat University Library or attached to it that has a lot of the documents. I think that what's very good is that we've seen the secondary school students who are involved in this present uprising going along to the remembrance event last month, and this never happened really before, because people didn't really know about it. The younger generation weren't really aware, and I think that they're very much aware. And what's come out of the present struggle is that they're looking at history. They're looking at 1932. They're looking at 1976. They're looking at all sorts of aspects of history, and that's a good thing. What is the influence of academics in exile? Well, I don't have any influence, but people like Bowin and Somsak Diem do have an influence on the movement, but it's an influence which I believe is fairly counterproductive, in that they're just concentrating on the monarchy, and they're concentrating, and they're arguing that the Ungpakorn is trying to become an absolute monarch and so on. And they're not really talking about how to beat the military. They're not talking about the necessary strategy and tactics of how to beat the military, which I think is incredibly important. But I mean, I'm sure that activists in Thailand are discussing this. You'd have to be if you were involved in these mass demonstrations and so on. Thanks.
What can activists do, socialists do around the world to give solidarity, concrete solidarity to the Thai people at this particular stage? I know that's a question that's often been asked, and I suspect I know what the answer is. You've got to get out and explain exactly what's happening. But has there been any pushback from those in the West towards the demands or towards the movement in Thailand, as there has been, say, with people who are protesting for their rights in Hong Kong? That's probably a bit more of a leading question. Thank you.
I think strategically, do you think that it is a very dangerous, and maybe this strategy will be a soft point that be used as a social conflict attack, by the royalists, if they focus on the monarchy reform instead of focus on the fair election and prior to go, and also constitution reform. I think Giles have said something about that, right? But that what I mean is that this strategy can be a weak point and being attacked, and when there is a conflict, again the military will declare emergency. Whether he used violence or not, but the whole thing will be go back to the circle. It looks like every time royalists will come out and increase this social conflict of both sides, and then the military have reason to declare something. So this, I'm just afraid that this circle will come back. So I don't know whether how Jai and they look at. Now we're very like excited, no? So the movement is increasing. I'm looking the circle pattern that have been repeating many times. Just worried about that will be repeat again. So how to avoid this? I heard that some people said it should be a neutral party to facilitate, you know, to this process, push the government, talk to the protesters, someone can be facilitate this process. Is that possible, or is this an option in order to break the cycle that it had happened before? That's one. Second, that how far we can see that this decentralized resistance now will win over this now. You know, we like to compare about Hong Kong, but you can see that Hong Kong looks like, you know, that yeah, it looks like how to say, there's a strength of the decentralized struggle like this, but there is also dangerous like this. In one point, it become if it be cracked down by the authority on different parts, and the leaders all in exile or disappeared, the whole movement become a movementless struggle. So that's also my concern. I very now look like very vibrant, you know, very excited. But I'm just worried that a movement run like this will go to what direction, especially look at Hong Kong, what happened, and will Thailand repeat like this? You know, as Jai said, that there's no political party, you know, no class struggle or whatever. And all this kit is like, if I'm not sure, is it uncoordinated? Is uncoordinated is a strength, or uncoordinated will be a weakness in one point? Now looks like people very excited, no? Wow, you know, a lot uprising, but how about this later, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, when their leaders keep being arrested? What will happen? Do they have second layers to take over? If no, it's same thing like red shirt movement. Leaders being cut off, and then the whole thing will be quiet. So I'm a bit worried about this. How you look at this situation, Dick and you? Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Well, like the military rule, it seems to be pretty primitive kind of ways of ruling. So I was wondering, except for the king as one of the reasons why they can still like have military rule in, you know, 21st century, is there any like social kind of, you know, 社会基础怎么说?
Social base, is it?
Yeah, like social base, or like social kind of, you know, ground for this kind of phenomenon, because it seems to be pretty, you know, pretty easy to be seen in Southeast Asia. But this is what happened in Japan, like in last century. So I was wondering, what is like the root of this phenomenon? And if we can, you know, find the real root of it, perhaps it's easier for us to, you know, see how to, you know, make a change or whatever. So thank you for the sharings.
Okay, in terms of solidarity, I think one of the important things is to try and raise the issue of political prisoners, because a lot of people are being arrested and face charges and so on. And also in countries that sell weapons to Thailand, I think it's worth raising that. And I know that Britain and France sell weapons as well. In terms of Western powers, I don't think that any of the outside powers are particularly interested one way or the other. I mean, they make statements and so on to make themselves look good, but really they just want to have good relations with whoever's in power. It's slightly different from the case of Hong Kong, because of course this can be used by the United States and China in order to increase their rivalry, even though you know, the protesters in Hong Kong in the main are not supporting the United States or anything like that. Is the call for the monarchy something that is a weakness? I don't think so. I think that it's untenable now, actually, to argue that we need to protect this particular monarch. Is completely discredited in many ways, and I think this is important to highlight this and not remain frightened, and I think that that's what they're doing. You know, if there have been some yellow shirt protests, but they're very, very small, and I think the yellow shirts are very weak. When people have come out wearing yellow shirts, often they're actually recruited by the government, local authority workers forced to wear yellow shirts, and then making the three-fingered salute in behind their backs and things like that. I mean, I don't see at the moment a danger of confrontation on a large scale with the yellow shirts. I think the greatest danger of confrontation is with the military and the police at the moment. How do you avoid violence? Well, I think that, you know, if you have workers' strikes stopping the country from functioning, then it's very difficult to use violence against this. It's different when people are protesting in the streets. You can use violence more easily. So, but you know, if you threaten to have a general strike, it's quite a powerful thing to prevent violence. In the case of facilitators, you see, the thing is that there are people arguing that, you know, maybe some compromise needs to be achieved. I think that this will be a dead end, especially, and also, you know, if this whole thing is kicked into parliamentary manoeuvres, it's going to be a dead end, because there is no way that in a compromise that the three demands can be successful. And the three demands are quite basic, you know. The resignation of the military dictator, the drafting of a properly democratic constitution. You can't really compromise on that, and also, you know, to reform the monarchy, because the monarchy is a problem. I mean, I would go further and say get rid of it, but it's difficult for people to say that, although they may be thinking it in their minds. And I think that facilitators can end up at the moment leading to compromises which I think unacceptable. You know, when the time comes, if the movement is powerful enough, the government will seek facilitators in order to save face as it resigns, or the soldiers go back to barracks. But you know, there has to be power from below in order to achieve an acceptable outcome. At this moment, some of the people are putting themselves forward as facilitators, are wanting to protect the status quo. There is class struggle in Thailand. I think these protests are a form of class struggle between those that rule and those that are ruled. Class struggle takes many forms, and there are workers' strikes in Thailand, and there is a trade union movement. The last slide I showed was was actually a workers' rally in Chonburi as part of the pro-democracy movement. And this is an area with a lot of vehicle assembly plants and auto parts plants and so on. So it's possible to get workers' strikes going if you know, the activists actually join hands with trade unionists and go out and actually talk and argue and encourage workers to take action. Now the issue of a decentralized leadership is very interesting, because the leadership of the present movement took a decision to push for grassroots leaders when they were starting to become when they were being arrested, and this has been successful to a certain extent. It's the strength of grassroots leadership, decentralization, that the protests have continued despite the fact that some of the key leaders have been arrested and were in detention. They're very well organized. One of the sites of the demonstration, they managed to distribute crash helmets and all sorts of things to people in a very disciplined way. The downside of the decentralization and grassroots leadership is that it's very difficult to come to a conclusion about a strategy, how you move forward, rather than just repeating the demonstrations. And this is where I think, you know, there is a need for a party. But we'll just have to see what people do.
How the struggle for democracy in Thailand can give impacts to the neighboring countries, particularly ASEAN community, in terms of political and economic issues.
Simply, if the comrade could repeat the name of the trade union that he mentioned and any other trade unions that have been active in the uprising or that have a robust rank and file under their name. Thank you.
Professor Giles, I would like you to ask some of your opinion. I am a student in Thailand right now, and I want to ask for your opinion on what do you think about our movement right now? Because in my opinion, I don't think we will win in the soon future or something like that. So what do you think? That this fight we are gonna win or not? Thank you.
Yeah, I just because I was aware that you're sharing about the photo of one of the people who bringing the rainbow flag. So I would like to see how others participants or other people think about LGBT people involved in this social movement, and how LGBT person involved in this. Thank you.
Okay. I actually forgot to answer the question about the reasons for military rule in Thailand. I mean, I don't actually think that there's a specific special set of circumstances connected with just Thailand that results in military rule. I think that the authoritarian regimes come to power when there's a weak structure, a weak civil society protecting the state and so on. I mean, in Western Europe, you saw authoritarian regimes come to power at the time of the Second World War, when these societies were in crisis, especially in Germany, in Italy, and in Spain. And that can happen anywhere in the world. There's nowhere that is immune to this, and it can happen in the form of fascism, or it can happen in the form of a military dictatorship, or other forms of authoritarian rule. Even the way that the European Union imposed its will on the Greek government, despite the fact that a majority of Greek people voted against the austerity, is a form of authoritarianism. And so I think that you have to look at the balance of forces between the military and the working class and other groupings within society, in order to see where the military what excuses they can have, or what opportunities they see. I mean, in fact, the military weren't necessarily that confident about staging the coup against Thaksin Shinawatra in 2006. They were made confident because of the protests involving middle-class people on the streets and the NGOs and the royalists. Without that, they would, I don't believe that they would have staged a coup d'etat. I don't believe they have the confidence to do that. In terms of the trade unions, the most promising trade unions at the moment, the ones that have joined the struggle, have supported the protests, are the area groups, which are made up of coalitions of rank and file trade unionists. For example, the area group at Borwin in Chonburi, which is a coalition at grassroots level of many unions in the auto industry or parts industry or electrical industry, or the Rangsit area groups and so on. So they're there's also some of the left-wing textile groupings. They're quite small, but you know, then in order to build strikes, the movement has to approach more than just these militant groups. It has to spread it into offices and other areas, transport and so on. I think that the Thai struggle will influence people who are struggling against dictatorships, authoritarianism, conservative societies in countries around Asia, but also it could go further than that, like it did with the Greek students. It depends whether the movement in Thailand wins or not. If it wins, then it will have a lot of influence on people. It will influence people who want to see democracy in Vietnam or Laos or in Myanmar, and so on. And so, you know, it really, I think it's quite natural that people who are in struggle or who wish to struggle, they look to other people's, especially to victories as to give them inspiration and so on. The LGBT involvement, I think it's really good in two ways. First of all, the fact that the struggle for democracy has blossomed into a struggle against authoritarianism in terms of sexual politics and so on. It's blossomed into demands for free and safe and legal abortions, or the demands for the self-determination in Patani. It actually shows the power and the militancy of the movement. If you compare it with the red shirts, it didn't reach that level. so that this is a good sign. How does it affect the people on the demonstration? Well, I think it has a really positive effect as well. People who may have been in two minds about GLBT activists and so on, when they see them on the demonstration with them, I think that it opens their minds. It means that they're prepared to support GLBT rights and so on. So I think that the two influence each other in a very positive way. Finally, will our side win? I mean, I would be stupid to give a simple answer to that. I want to see the movement win. But I believe that in order to win, then serious questions need to be discussed among the people, the activists, about how they can raise the level of struggle to make Thailand ungovernable in order to push Prayut to resign. And I think that part of that, the important part of that is spreading the struggle to the working class. Of course, there are other ways to make Thailand ungovernable. Rioting in the streets, petrol bombs and so on is another way to do it. But that way would involve great loss of life, because the army would come in and crack down. So I don't think it's a useful road to go down. If other people can think of ways to make Thailand ungovernable, which are actually can be put into practice, then all well and good. But I don't think that, refusing to go to a degree ceremony or sort of individual acts of non-violence which don't involve strikes, I don't see that will lead to the end of the present military dictatorship. I see the answer in spreading it to workers' struggles. Thank you.
Right. Yeah, thank you very much for answering the question, like civil society. Yeah. So I was also wondering, where does the money coming from? For example, for the military kind of, and who are they? I was pretty confused about. Seemingly they don't have a leader, so I was wondering how can they become, the ruling kind of, not a party, but a leading a ruling force. And since Thailand, I'm not sure whether Thailand is still an agricultural society or it's a more like, industrialized society. So even if workers go protest, does it necessarily make it, not able to be ruled? Because when I go to Thailand, many people complain to me, one of the burden for democracy is actually the, farmers, because they're easily, 贿赂怎么说?
Like,
bribed by, easily bribed by the politicians. So I was wondering, about these questions. Thank you very much.
I didn't quite understand the beginning bit where you said about where does the money come from? Where does the money come from for the protests? Is that what you're asking?
Oh no, I was wondering, where does the money coming for the military, if they need to rule, they need the money to support them, right? So is there from taxations or manipulating some of the resources or business? So that is my question. Or they don't really need the financial resource for their ruling.
Well, the military have huge financial resources, because when they take power, even when they don't take power, the military budget is huge, and some of it is secret. And also the generals line their own pockets because they're on boards of companies. The military have their own bank, and so on. So the military have can tap into huge resources, like the military anywhere actually, military in Britain or in Malaysia or anywhere else, if the circumstances are right. So it's not that they just decide to stage a coup without any resources. In terms of Thailand, Thailand is not a predominantly agricultural country. The vast majority of people work outside agriculture. So the working class is probably the biggest class in Thailand, although it can be fragmented in certain areas. Now, the complaint that you hear, that you've just mentioned, the idea that farmers can easily be bribed, that is a complaint, a rather insulting complaint in many ways, which is common among the middle classes who support military rule. They were saying that people voted for Thaksin because they were stupid. They didn't quite say stupid. They said they couldn't access the right information, which means they were stupid. But the idea that you would be stupid to vote for a government that brought in the first universal health care scheme, the idea that you would be stupid to vote for a government that said, well, poor people are not a burden, they should be partners in development. That's not stupidity. That's actually responding to serious political issues. There have been anthropological studies in the countryside that show that people look at the policies of political parties and weigh up the issues and change their minds. It's if anything, the rise of Thaksin's political party meant that vote buying became rather redundant, because for the first time in a long time in Thai history, Thaksin's political party had serious policies which, once it was elected, it put into practice. So these are really insults from the middle classes who think that anyone who isn't middle class is stupid.
You said that about the importance of the workers' struggle in this process. So I would like to know that how you look at the possibility that the leftist, if there are any leftist students still there in Thailand, and also will they able to work in cooperation with the progressive and leftist union and to move forward to that direction on economic, on strike or whatever. So, and therefore, before to plan about this strategy, I'm very curious to know about, is there any assessment about how the working class now generally feel about the student protest? Are they in the mode of in solidarity? It means that the conditions are very good. If yes, so the organizer, the leftist student and the unionist, the progressive, it is a time to be able to take them, to get their support. What is the mood of the workers now? Yeah, generally, those who are not being unionized, but what is their mood? That will determine this strategy will work or not. Yeah, okay, thanks.
I think that the young people that are leading this protest are actually articulating the anger and frustration of millions of Thai people. At the last election, which was fixed by the military junta, the opposition parties actually gained more popular votes than the military coalition, and things have got worse since. So my guess is that you know, that the protesters are speaking on behalf of millions of ordinary Thai people, which includes ordinary working people, working class people, and so on. And I think that we see signs of this by the fact that the numbers of people joining the protests, up and down the country. And you see this in a very clear form in the places where there are a lot of factories and so on. People have, ordinary workers have joined the protests, and especially in Chonburi, the protests were actually organized by, as I've said, by the area group. So I think the time is right to spread the issue among the working class. The problem is that you need significant numbers of people, of young activists, of students and so on, to actually go out and talk to ordinary working people, because for people to go on strike, take political strikes, it's you can't just announce it on social media. In fact, someone did announce that the 14th of October there would be a general strike. Of course, it never happened. You actually need to go out and talk to people. You need to address the worries and concerns that they have about, you know, will I get sacked if I go on strike? Will the police arrest me, etc., 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 and build up these relationships. Now, in order, the kind of people that are interested in that tend to be left-wing. There are left-wing activists among some of the more progressive unions. There are left-wing students, but they're not organized in an organization, a political party. I mean, I was involved in setting up such a political party, small political party, outside, which was outside of Parliament and so on. But that fell apart when the 2014 military coup took place, and before that, when I had to go into exile and so on. So there are shoots of small green shoots of socialists. There is a mood among ordinary working people, but there is hard work that needs to be done on the ground in order to make sure that strikes happen. And I personally don't see that that they can make the country ungovernable unless people do go on strike. And I'm not just talking, I've said before, I'm not just talking about industrial workers. I'm talking about people who unionize, who work in banks, people who work in public transport and so on. These people can make the country ungovernable, but it takes a lot of hard work to actually build up the links and so on to make that happen.
The question is, where is the movement getting its financial support? Some on the social media are saying it's a US influence with funding. This is a question from Ray.
Well, it's absolute nonsense that the US is funding it, but it is quite typical of conspiracy theories. This is a grassroots movement. People are chipping in their money. There are also celebrities who have more money than other people who are helping with it. But you know, this is a huge mass movement. There's no one pulling strings behind it. It's not Thaksin, it's not the US government, it's not the Chinese government or anything like that. Because if you really look at the nature of the conspiracy theories, what they're saying is that ordinary people are incapable of organizing protests on their own. They need to be led there by people with money, or they need to be manipulated. I mean, this kind of thing is argued about all mass movements and so on, and it's just not true. It's not being manipulated or controlled by anyone. It's actually a genuine mass movement.
Yes, can you hear me? Yes, okay. Yes, thank you very much. I also agree with you. I was just reflecting on things that I've noticed on the social media, saying that, and actually showing examples that U.S. Embassy in Thailand has a democracy action campaigns, and people can get financing for a democratic action. But I agree. I think I agree with what you're saying, that I think it's obvious that it's a mass movement that's being, activated on many grassroots levels, and not necessarily being influenced by any particular outside international influence. I want to thank you very much for all of you for such a informative and instructive teach-in tonight, and it certainly gave me a lot to think about in terms of this, because I've been following it for quite a few months. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Okay, thanks a lot to Giles. Actually, before we end, as I mentioned earlier, this teach-in organized by the PSM, Socialist Party of Malaysia, in solidarity with the pro-democracy movement in Thailand. So before we end this session, I would like to ask the participants to participate in a solidarity gesture to show solidarity with the movement.
Solidarity